In our last lecture, we looked at Berkeley's use of empiricism to argue for an idealist metaphysic. In this lecture, we look at the master of 18th century empiricism, really the dominant figure in that tradition, and that is David Hume, one of the most important, and in many ways one of the more attractive figures in the Western philosophical tradition. He was, in fact, a man of great wit, affability, and charm, who was a very popular figure both in Parisian salon society as well as in his native Edinburgh. But with respect to his philosophical musings during his life, particularly the texts we're going to be looking at in our series, An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, and then in the subsequent lectures, was actually fairly obscure. And the reason we'll see is because his arguments were not only rather dry and technical, but also led to extremely skeptical conclusions. In his own lifetime, he was a famous writer, but not actually as a philosopher, more because of his moral and political essays, and especially his multi-volume History of England, which was probably the great classic of its time. But it's in his philosophical work on empiricism that Hume brings that tradition that Locke had begun and Berkeley had moved forward to its real logical conclusion and fulfillment. And the Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding really represents the culmination of the 18th century empiricist speculative project. So what we're going to look for then in Hume is two things. One, how does he deploy empiricism differently than Locke and Berkeley? In particular, how does he use it to support what we'll see are extremely skeptical conclusions? And in this case, we'll look at, again, his basic analysis of sense datum, his understanding of the relations between ideas and matters of fact, and his analysis of how we explain our knowledge of cause and effect in the world. Then we'll turn to what I think is the second important issue that Hume addresses. Given this sort of skeptical analysis, what are the implications for traditional metaphysics? And we'll see that what Hume in fact does is dissolve metaphysical disputes, rendering traditional metaphysical notions into what he considers dogmas. And here we'll look at his reduction of the question of power, force, and necessary connection, his discussion of the question of freedom and determinacy, and finally his critique of the question of miracles, prophecy, and revealed religion. And then we'll take a look at what, for Hume, is the practical implications of his skeptical reasoning. Okay, so let's begin with his analysis of experience on empiricist grounds. Like all empiricists, Hume recognized that all of our mental representations or ideas, images between our ears, as it were, the phenomenal stuff of which our experience is made, can be divided into two classes, which are traditionally referred to as impressions, on the one hand, and ideas. Impressions, which we presume are the result of sense datum, are in fact, and here he follows Berkeley, really distinguished by ideas by their relative phenomenal vivacity or force, by which I mean when we claim to have a sense experience of something which produces an idea in our minds, it's always much more detailed, powerful, clear, and distinct than the reflection or recollection of that image which we can later recall to our minds. So that first class of phenomena are impressions, and the second are ideas, what he sometimes calls thoughts, which again are distinguished by their lack of force and internal clarity. We presume that these ideas are in fact copies of impressions, and one of the reasons we do presume this is because they generally succeed them. Right? Following Locke's conception of tabula rasa, we in fact do not have an idea of a horse until we've actually seen a horse and have had impressions of it. And it's that temporal sequence, we'll see for Hume, that tends to, at least in his mind, lead us to argue for cause and effect. Now I want to stress this because Hume is going to make all of his arguments based on introspection and scientific observation of his own experience. Hume is very much a child of the Enlightenment. He exemplifies its project of the creation of a scientific culture. And indeed, Hume endeavored to be what he called the Newton of the moral sciences, to create a purely scientific philosophy, and as we'll see in subsequent lectures, moral theory as well, one based entirely on observations. So, on the basis of such introspection and scientific observation, Hume claims that there are, in fact, only three principles with which the mind associates its various ideas. And these are resemblance, spatiotemporal contiguity, and cause and effect. You have an image of me as you look at me, you close your eyes and you try to recreate that image in your mind. Presumably that resembles the first. Hence we have resemblance. You see this lectern in this lecture, you leave and go to lunch, you return and see it again, you note its resemblance. All right, so that's one of the natural categories under which ideas are related. Second is spatiotemporal contiguity. You see me on this position on the podium at this moment, I move 2 steps to the right, and then you see me again in another position and you note that I have filled up the spaces in between, both in space and in time. And that's presumably one of the sources in which you see an identity between all of the experiences you had as I moved 2 steps to the right. Spatial contiguity, spatiotemporal contiguity, I should say, creates that sense of identity, that relation between those various experiences you had of me just a few seconds ago. And finally, cause and effect. Right? If I release an object and it falls down, you tend to assume that its falling was caused by my releasing it. Okay, so that also relates ideas. Again, resemblance, spatiotemporal contiguity, and cause and effect. All right. All of our knowledge, therefore, can be broken into one of 2 classes, right? And our knowledge deals with ideas. So the first class of knowledge deals solely with the relations between ideas. What he means by this is intuitively certain knowledge, the sort of thing we find in pure logic and in mathematics. Such knowledge is always either intuitively certain. For instance, if I tell you the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, I can offer no demonstration for it, but it's an intuitively certain axiom which you'll usually accept. So that's one way of knowing of the relations between ideas, or it's capable of logical proof or demonstration. Once you intuitively are aware that the shortest distance between two lines is between 2 points, I should say, is a straight line, you can recursively build perhaps Pythagorean Pythagoras' theorem. Right? Both of these are logical and necessary, one based on intuition, the other built up from intuition through demonstration. And again, the obvious examples are mathematics and logic. I stress this because it's critical for Hume, and as we'll see, subsequent logical positivist philosophers, that such propositions have no existential implication. Whether there really exist such things as points and straight lines or not, will not change the truth value of the claim that the shortest distance between two points is a straight line. Okay. Similarly, if I give you a logical truth, either it is raining or it is not raining. That certainly is true based on the way we understand the word or. It exhausts all the possibilities. But that doesn't actually tell you any factual knowledge about the world. It simply tells you about, as it were, the relations between concepts or ideas. So it's the second class of knowledge which is actually going to be far more important. And that is those that deal with matters of fact, those that do have existential implications, implications about the nature of existence. Okay. Now, obviously, these truths or this knowledge has no logical basis. And that's for the simple reason that we can always imagine counterfactuals. For example, were I to release this pen, it would fall downward, right? That's a matter-of-fact knowledge. But it is logically possible that it could either hover in the air or float up to heaven. It never has, but it is logically possible. Therefore, we cannot say that, as a matter of fact, this object will decelerate downward if I release it, is based on any sort of logical knowledge. It's, in fact, purely based on, as we'll see, our experience. So the critical epistemological question is, how can we know matters of fact other than what you're immediately experiencing? right? That of which you're aware, you're immediately aware of. That's not a problem. But how do you know anything else besides that? And it turns out the answer is the principle of cause and effect, because it's cause and effect that allows us to infer from seen to unseen phenomena. You come back in 15 minutes, you find that this lectern is 3 feet to the right. You therefore can deduce that someone must have come in and moved it. Right, that's the notion of cause and effect. It allows you to infer the unseen phenomena that someone came in the room and moved the lectern. Now, how do we know about cause and effect? It's certainly not known a priori or before experience. It's not known by logical analysis. And we know this because all of our cause and effect relations are, in fact, it's possible to imagine them working out differently. We mentioned this counterfactual as being logical. So it must come from our experience of constant conjunctions. This pen will decelerate downward if I release it, because every time you've seen an object released, it decelerated downward. Okay. This is important for Hume, because what that means is that all of our knowledge of matters of fact, the most recondite form of which is science, are ultimately based only on experience, and therefore never give us absolute knowledge. They never give us ultimate answers. They only basically push back the envelope of our ignorance. Okay. As Hume puts it, and I want to quote, "Elasticity, gravity, cohesion of parts, communication of motion by impulse, these are probably the ultimate causes and principles which we shall ever discover in nature. And we may esteem ourselves sufficiently happy if, by accurate enquiry and reasoning, we can trace up the particular phenomena to, or near to, these general principles. But, and this is critical, the most perfect philosophy of the natural kind only staves off our ignorance a little longer. Objects accelerate downward because of the laws of gravity. What causes the laws of gravity? Got me." Okay? And Hume takes this a step further. As perhaps the most perfect philosophy of the moral or metaphysical kind serves only to discover larger portions of it, the next great issues that need to be explored. Okay, so what have we established so far? That all of our knowledge of matters of fact is based on cause and effect. And cause and effect is in turn based on our experience of constant conjunctions. The next question becomes, what warrants our belief in experience? Right? Which is to say, what makes us believe that the future will resemble the present, and that the past has resembled the present? One could imagine that in 10 minutes the laws of gravity will change dramatically, and henceforth objects will accelerate up. One can also imagine that there is a divine providence and God really exists, and that when he did create the world, he created it with the earth at the center, and things moved sometime before Copernicus took over. So the biblical account was true. Now, given that these are logical possibilities, how can we warrant our belief in experience? Well, we can't do it on the basis of reason. For as I've mentioned, it's logically possible that the future will not resemble the present. It's logically possible that in 5 minutes, pens will start floating up to heaven. The same with the past. It is logically possible that once upon a time, objects accelerated downward at a different rate than they currently do. Well, we can't turn to support this position by embracing the notion of causality. Causality can't warrant the belief in experience because it depends on experience, right? We found that the belief in cause and effect is based on our experience. So it would be circular to then invoke cause and effect to explain experience. And experience obviously can't teach us that the future will resemble the past because all arguments based on experience presuppose that the future will resemble the past. So how do we get our knowledge of experience which allows us to actually know something about the world? And this is where Hume achieves his profound skeptical result. The answer is basically psychological disposition and instinct. He uses the word custom or habit. It's not, in fact, rationally provable to believe that the future will resemble the past. But it's customary, it's natural, and in practical life, it's inescapable. It would be perverse to try to live as if you expected tomorrow that objects would move upwards. So experience is in this sense warranted by a sort of natural instinct, not a rational proof. And it's that natural instinct that makes us feel that the future will resemble the present. And again, I'd like to quote Hume, as Hume states, wherever the repetition of any particular act or operation produces a propensity to renew the same act or operation without being impelled by any reasoning or process of the understanding, we always say that this propensity is the effect of custom. To jump ahead, all inferences from experience, therefore, are effects of custom, not of reasoning. Custom, then, is the great guide of human life. It is that principle alone which renders our experience useful to us and makes us expect for the future a similar train of events with those which have appeared in the past. And Hume offers actually some good empirical grounds to believe that it must be custom and not reasoning that allows us to have to warrant our belief in experience and therefore cause and effect. Take the case of small children, all of whom act on the basis of experience in a stimulus and response way, but none of whom are capable of abstract reasoning. So they could not have come up with a rational proof for warranting their experience. Yet they do trust their experiences. That's a sign that there's some sort of natural instinct in us that propels us to accept experience. Similarly, we could think of those who are, that Hume refers to as dolts, who are simple-minded and incapable of abstract demonstrations, yet nonetheless always act on the basis of their experience. As for that matter, do various animals, which are teachable and trainable. Dogs are. Yet no one would expect that they're capable of abstract reasoning. Therefore, we know that there must be some sort of instinctual disposition or custom which leads us to have such belief. Okay. Well, that's an extremely skeptical position. It ultimately says that our knowledge is based on a sort of instinct, and that that's not much of a rational basis at all. That it's simply practical. I want to turn then to that second issue. What does Hume do with this sort of skepticism? And we'll see that he deploys it to undermine most of the central metaphysical doctrines of the 18th century. If all of our knowledge of matters of fact is based on cause and effect, which is in turn based on experience, where do we derive our metaphysical doctrines of, and I want to start with this one, power? We could refer to it as power or force or necessary connection, that somehow there's some basic power that causes one billiard ball to communicate motion to another billiard ball when struck. Well, obviously there's no logical doctrine of necessary connection in the world, because logical proofs, as we've mentioned, have no existential implications. Again, we could imagine counterfactuals. The billiard ball strikes another billiard ball, and they stop moving. There is no necessary connection there. So neither necessary connection, force, or power arise from sense. And you can, again, think of this in a very straightforward way. You can't imagine the color of a necessary connection, the odor of a power, or the flavor of a force. So, what we might feel to be experiences of force, for example, like the power to lift your arm when you choose, right? That's the famous case that I think either Tolstoy or Dostoevsky used against Hume. You know, I have necessary power, I choose to lift my arm, it lifts. That too is actually based on experience. And we can observe this with a man stricken with palsy, who will attempt to lift his arm in vain. Or someone who's recently been amputated, who feels something in his leg when it's not actually there. So mysteriously in these cases, the necessary connection or force disappears. Then what is the basis of our belief in necessary connection? It's just a very powerful psychological condition we experience. Certain of our conjunctions are so constant, we are so used to finding one billiard ball strike another and the other one move, that we tend to assume that that's somehow universal. But there's no logical basis from that, right? That's entirely a psychological reality, not a logical one. Okay. I want to turn now to the second issue that Hume critiques, which is the notion of liberty and necessity, one of the great philosophic debates of the 17th and 18th centuries. Is the world a mechanistic, material realm of phenomena in which everything is part of a causal nexus? Or are humans agents with free will and choice? Now, Hume is going to take a very, what I would call, belittling attitude here by arguing, somewhat controversially, that the only difference between these positions is one of verbal dispute, that practically everyone has always agreed about the real meaning of liberty and the real nature of necessity. Well, let's start first with necessity. Necessity and causation, which are the very essence of determinism, are simply the result of our experience of constant conjunctions. We've seen that. And our expectation, based on custom, that the future will resemble the past. So there is no, in fact, logical proof for determinacy. It's simply a psychological disposition. Liberty, by way of contrast, is merely the absence of external restraint. It has nothing to do with some abstruse doctrine of a free or uncaused will. In fact, it's perfectly consistent with a causally determined universe. And here Hume is speaking in a very commonsensical way about what English-speaking people mean by the word liberty. Simply the absence of external restraint, either by some individual, by an institution, or by the state. And that is, in fact, the kind of liberties we find in our own Bill of Rights. And that has nothing to do with the causal nature of the universe. But Hume wants to make a stronger argument. He wants to show that the view that our wills are somehow uncaused is, in fact, philosophically and practically impossible. Okay, that's a very strong claim. And his argument will be that if we genuinely did have a free will, that would mean that that will would be uncaused, that our choices and actions would not be the result of some sort of causal law or causal principle. All assume that our actions are caused, and they are caused by our characters. So were I to pull out a gun and shoot one of you, you would be wise to punish me and arrest me, precisely because that act probably is a result of some character trait I have, perhaps a violent homicidal rage. And that act would then be something I would be likely to repeat again in similar circumstances. And indeed, if you think of practical life, it is always based on the expectation that people's behaviors reflect their character, and that you can, in fact, predict people's behaviors. Even in common sense things like shaking hands. Right? I mean, I don't know how many of you have seen Marx Brothers movies, but you rarely expect when you put out your hand to meet a stranger, a harpo, when he puts his knee in your hand. Right? That's not part of our regular range of experience, and that's because we do, in fact, believe that we can predict the behavior of others. If you think about your relations with family members and friends and close acquaintances, very often you know that if you say certain things to them, you can expect certain sorts of reactions. Okay. So in this case, what have we found? Again, that whole metaphysical dispute has been dissolved. There is no logical basis to the belief in determinism, and free will itself is incoherent. I want then to turn to the third issue that Hume attacks, and this one perhaps the most controversial of all, is his doctrine of miracles. We'd seen before that Locke had critiqued the notion of immediate revelations. Hume goes a step further and wants to critique the biblical revelations found in the Christian tradition. And we'll see Hume is, in fact, a great agnostic. Now, what is a miracle? Miracles are, by definition, violations of the laws of nature, right? The water turns into blood. Manna rains from heaven. The Red Sea is parted. What makes them miraculous is that they violate our constant experiences. What makes them miraculous is that we never see manna fall from heaven, we never see the Red Sea parted, and we never see water turned into wine. But those laws of nature are, in fact, the result of the sum of human knowledge and experience. So clearly, there can be no rational grounds to believe in miracles. Right? And that here, Hume is turning into turning his skepticism into a very irreligious direction. And he's going to adduce several arguments for this belief that there are no rational grounds in miracles, by pointing out that, first of all, where do we find miracles? Right? We find miracles in the Old Testament when the Hebrews are a rather primitive, barbaric, nomadic people, once they settle and become a settled agricultural people and sophisticated, miracles cease. We find miracles in Mexico, Our Lady of Guadalupe, but we never find miracles in Manhattan. Rarely do we experience crying virgins in the middle of Washington, D.C. And that, for him, suggests that, again, miracles are largely irrational. But Hume turns this into what I would argue is a wonderfully delicious and ironic turn against Christian belief. His refutation of miracles to show their irrationality shows that Christianity itself is irrational. And I quote, "I am the better pleased with the method of reasoning here delivered, as I think it may serve to confound those dangerous friends or disguised enemies to the Christian religion who have undertaken to defend it by the principles of human reason. Our most holy religion is founded on faith, not on reason, and it is a sure method of exposing it to put it to such a trial as it is by no means fitted to endure." And that's that very dry, sarcastic side to Hume. And I want to quote from the end of this passage, which is also just marvelously ironic. "We may conclude that the Christian religion not only was at first attended with miracles, but even at this day cannot be believed by any reasonable person without one. Mere reason is insufficient to convince us of its veracity, and whoever is moved by faith to assent to it is conscious of a continued miracle in his own person, which subverts all the principles of his understanding and gives him a determination to believe what is most contrary to custom and experience." What makes that such a powerfully ironic statement is that, in fact, it can be read one of two ways. You can read it as an orthodox Calvinist statement, which is that religion does in fact violate the rules of reason, and that proves the truth of religion precisely because of the mystery of divine grace, which puts the habit of faith within us. And Hume was in fact of a Scottish, i.e. Calvinist background. But you could also read that, if you chose, as I think Hume probably himself believed, as derisive, as insulting towards religion, as essentially arguing the fundamental miracle is that anyone with a high school education could believe this sort of rubbish. Right? And that's at the very essence of what Enlightenment esotericism was all about. So what has Hume shown us? Well, if we choose to adopt the Cartesian system of doubt, there is no resolution for it, outside of adducing principles like custom or habit, which have no rational basis. Which is to say, if you doubt the truth of your faculties, that they are in fact accurately representing sense, it is impossible to prove that they reflect the world, that there is a world out there beyond your experiences, and therefore, if you choose to embrace the Cartesian position, you can't in fact escape solipsism. Then how do we get beyond skepticism? And this is where Hume becomes the great liberating theorist. Skepticism is refuted only by practical life. There is no philosophic refutation for it. And that is because, in practical life, there is no possible reason one would embrace extreme skepticism. What is the point of it? Does it mean that now that you doubt the existence of the external world, you're no longer going to eat? You're no longer going to dress? What practical reason could you have to believe in such a doctrine? Okay. So in that sense, all of the skepticism that Hume himself has expressed is a sort of elaborate metaphysical joke. But it does have a moral point. Moderate skepticism, not the extreme Pyrrhonian time, but moderate skepticism does have a practical value. It teaches us how uncertain our most basic views are. It teaches us to eschew the dogmatism of, in his case, rationalistic philosophy, but also what he also saw as problematic, the intolerance of learned Christian orthodoxy. It is that experience of free thinking, trust in common sense, which lay at the very heart of the Enlightenment and has made David Hume one of its most important representatives.